Hello guys, and welcome to a brand new video on the channel. As I'm sure you've guessed by the title, today we're talking fantasy football, and in particular a guide to give you an extra edge in your fantasy mini leagues. Now, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or maybe you've been playing the game for quite a few years, I hope you'll be able to take something away from this video that may give you that slight edge in your mini leagues and help you rise at the table in the global standings. If you found the video helpful or you at least learned something new, if you could like the video down below, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the fantasy football uploads coming later this week. Keep an eye out. So the structure of the video is going to be pretty simple. We're going to start off with the most basic hints that will give you those slight edges, and then we're going to work our way on to the more advanced things that you can do as a player to improve your standings in your mini leagues. So without further ado, let's get into the tips. First and foremost, tip number one is don't plan too far ahead. It's almost pointless looking past weeks 4 to 5 because your view on those individual players and teams is almost certainly unlikely to look exactly the same way. However, if you are feeling a bit different and you feel like you want to start with a team that is a bit off the beaten track, I absolutely recommend it for this season in particular. Now, for people who, like most, probably don't read the terms and conditions of most things you sign up to, fantasy football has a big caveat this season, and that is the World Cup. Now, in most years, managers get 2 wildcards per season, one from the start all the way up till the end of the year, and then one after the year as well, up until the end of the season. However, it is different this season. We actually have 3 wildcards. Now that means that you can take a gamble. If you want to try something completely different from week 1 to throw everyone else off their game and potentially make a short-term gain, then it's absolutely worth doing. If you're the type of person that may actually think, you know what, let's try my bench boost first week. I don't always recommend it, but this year could actually work. You could bench boost in week 1 and then decide to even wildcard in week 2, going straight back to the team that you think will be best going forward for the next 3 or 4 weeks. So this year is a real chance to try something new and experiment with teams. But the number one thing is don't look too far ahead because your view on teams will change very quickly. Okay, so next we're going to go through some very basic aspects to the game that many people who have been playing it for a long time will already know and be very familiar with. However, if you are new to the game, it's very much worth keeping these things in mind on a week-to-week basis. First of all, don't leave your goalkeeper as your vice captain. When you make your team automatically and you select enter and your pick team selection comes up, your goalkeeper always starts as your vice captain. Now, you don't want to leave that for the whole season as many managers do, because there is always rotation and shock injuries that can appear every single week. Man City is a prime example. If you're wanting to cap someone like Erling Haaland, the worst thing you can do is have your goalkeeper as your vice captain. Pep is notorious for rotating his teams, and you may end up having an absolute stinker in goal who's just got 1 point doubled into 2 for you. Make sure you vice captain a player you genuinely wouldn't mind being your captain if your main captain cannot play. On the topic of players not playing and players needing to be subbed in and out, make sure you have your bench in the correct order you want those players to potentially come onto the pitch. Very often, managers will set their starting 11 and just leave their bench as is. It is very important you put the right players in slots 1, 2, and 3. The reason being is that your first sub will be the first player that comes on if your player as captain or whatever position does not play for whatever reason. You do not want the case that you've put, say you've got a 5th midfielder that's worth 4.5 million who plays on a regular basis but actually doesn't pick up any points. You just got him there as a filler to come off the bench for you, whilst you may have a player of higher value and higher importance to your overall team as your 2nd or 3rd sub, who is then unable to bring you those extra points off the bench if a starter fails to play for you. Another simple thing that people forget is that you can only accrue 1 extra transfer every single week. So for example, in week 2, if you decide not to use your transfer, you're pretty happy how your week 1 went and your team is good enough to just go straight back into the next week and you roll over transfer. In week 3, you'll then have 2 transfers to use. However, if you choose not to use a transfer that week, it does not roll over. 2 is the most you can have at any given time, Be wary of that, because if you need to make a change, even if it's just a small one for an injury, it's worth doing if you've got 2 transfers already in the bank. Now, it's incredibly important to build up squad value as you're going through. It may give you the extra edge in the middle or later on in the season to be able to bring in another premium player that most people in your mini league cannot afford. Now, within fantasy football, the structure and way that works is that if a player is in form and they're doing well in real life, more managers are likely to start bringing them in. Now, this is done on a percentage basis. So if a certain amount of managers as a percentage bring in a player, then their value increases. Therefore, it's very possible, even by Christmas, that you could have a team value of roughly 103 to 104 million. And that difference of 3 and 4 million is massive when you're fighting off people in your mini league. Therefore, it's really important to remember the following things. First of all, when you are selling a player and they've gained in value, you only gain half of what they're actually worth at that point. So for example, say you buy Riyad Mahrez at the start of the season, week 2, week 3, whatever. You sell him a few weeks later after some very good performances, and he's now worth a whole 8.4 million. Say you fancy cashing in, you do not get the full 8.4 million. You will only get 8.2. So the difference is very simple. You've got an £8 million asset, you've gained 0.4, you get 50% of those profits, you actually get given 0.2. That's very important to remember. If you're trying to do short-term moves and you actually want to get that player back in the future, you may be better off holding on to them because you might not be able to afford them once you've sold them. Additionally, many people will choose to use their wildcard over an international break in order to gain as much value as they can within a rough 2-week period of the internationals taking place. Now, whilst this is usually a very good idea, it's also very important to remember one thing. Players only go up 0.3 million within a single game week turnover. That means from, for example, game week 2 to game week 3, say if Cristiano Ronaldo comes into an incredible vein of form, he can only go up 0.3 million within that single week between their game weeks. Therefore, the max you'll ever be able to get on a player within 2 individual game weeks is a 0.1 game. This is again important to remember, just as I mentioned before with the example of Mahrez. If you are just trying to gain money within your wildcard period, remember the players you actually want to keep within your squad. If you can't afford to bring them back in, they're probably not worth selling in the first place. Keep hold of your value. Now, I mentioned right at the start of the video the temptation to potentially use one of your chips in game week 1 in the bench boost. However, it is generally advised that you use your chips in the last rough quarter of the season. Now, the reason being is because many cup games get cancelled for the big teams and then also the teams they're meant to be playing that week due to their progression in the FA Cup. These transfers are then rearranged, generally put into the later end of the season between game weeks 32 to roughly 37. The outcome of this is that teams will have 2 games to play within 1 game week rather than the normal 1. This gives you an opportunity to use a chip such as Bench Boost or even Triple Captain to get double the amount of points that you may have otherwise been able to have got earlier in the season under a single game week. Now, the temptation may be there, especially early on when you feel like you maybe had a bad week and you want to make up for a loss, to use one of these big chips in the early going. However, it's incredibly important to remember that FPL is very much a marathon and not a sprint. This is a 10-month-old campaign that you're going to be involved in, and it's better to make up those losses later when you have a better opportunity and find those differentials than it is chasing short-term losses that will put you in a worse position down the line when the people you're competing with still have those chips ready to use and you no longer have your own. Okay, we're moving into the more refined tips for the up-and-coming season now. The first conversation we're going to look at is formations. Now, the game has changed a lot in the last few years. Before, we used to have very much an emphasis on how many top attackers can you get in one team. However, with the way that teams like Liverpool have played with false nines up front, and Man City in the last few years since Aguero has left very much just operating without a striker, the emphasis has very much changed. Whilst the options in midfield still stay very strong, the best way that we've now seen to find value within the market is in the defence. And the proof is very much in the pudding from what we saw last season. Defenders were able to accrue many points both through clean sheets but also their goal contributions going forward. An expert example of that is very much Trent Alexander-Arnold, who can usually get more assists than most strikers or midfielders in FPL. Now, a feature within FPL that many people will find useful, whether or not you're a beginner or you're a more advanced level player, is the points per million system. What this feature allows you to see is, based on the value that that player has this season, how many points per million would they've scored based on their output last season. This is a great indication of where you can find value in the game that you may not necessarily have thought was there. To highlight the point that we've seen this big shift from attackers to defenders, last season there were 36, that's right, 36 defenders with a better points per million than the best performing striker last season, which was Ivan Toney. Even his teammate Ethan Pinnock had a higher points per million value than Toney last season. Therefore, if you are new to the game, you're far better off to put your money into defenders who can also get points going forward, because they will be better value than even your strikers. Now, the reason for this is because they score a higher amount of points per goal. A striker will only score 4 points per goal. A midfielder scores 5, and a defender and even a goalkeeper, strangely, scores 6. Meaning, if you have a player in defense who can score you a lot of goals, they will benefit from that far more greatly than an attacker will. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this video to this point, and we're going into the final tip that I can give you for this upcoming season. Now, this tip is a little bit different. It's not based upon anything that's really that obvious in terms of output of a player. It's more based around an observation that I've had through playing the game over the years, and especially with the change in shift that we've seen from attackers being less and less valuable. Now, that change is the fact that we are no longer seeing many teams that have 3 premium attackers, or even in some cases as many as 2 premium attackers. People are far more likely and more inclined to put at least one 4.5 million option striker on their bench this season. Now, the purpose of this video wasn't to call out individual players to buy and not to buy, as those videos will come later in the week. Make sure you stay tuned to watch those. However, a real obvious thing that I've picked up on this season is that many people have been going for Greenwood from Leeds as their 4.5 million option up front. And it's very simple to see why, especially for the beginning people who have come to start playing fantasy football. And that is because out of the 4.5 million options, and I think there's about 6 of them this season, he was by far the highest scoring last season. Therefore, it only makes perfect sense to have this player on your bench just in case maybe a player or two doesn't play and he may get on for a point here or there. However, my suggestion would be is if you're struggling to fit the right amount of players into your team. However, my suggestion would be if you are struggling to fit those players who are going to play regularly in your team, you may want to relook the structure of your team rather than picking a player such as this. However, the reason being, even though it's quite complex, is actually really simple when you put your mind to it. And it comes back to what we talked about earlier in terms of player values changing based on their ownership percentage. Now, as I've said, many people aren't going for premium attackers so far this season. However, that's not guaranteed to stay the same way. There may be a player or two that emerge from lower down, so around the 5 million to 7 million player value in attack, that outperform the defenders and midfielders that we've all picked so far this season. And what that will trigger is a change in the power curve of FPL. Now, if this change occurs, you're going to want to be on the right side of it. And the first thing you're likely to do is sell your assets at 4.5 million, that cheaper striking option you have, in order to bring in a player sort of like around Watkins level, maybe Bamford, and then you'll also sell a midfielder to facilitate those moves. However, unless you act straight away, you're going to have a problem. Other people would have already had the same idea as you, and they've started selling their 4.5 mil striker already. And what will happen to that player when a certain percentage of managers sell him is that his price will already start dropping. So by the time you get round to deciding whether or not you want to pick the informed Bamford or the informed Watkins, your Greenwood could already be worth as low as 4.2 million if the curve is that strong. And the reason why I think the curve could be that strong this season is that this is a standout season. We've not seen the emphasis on defenders be as heavy as this in the past, and the strikers be neglected to such a high extent. Therefore, my advice would be, if you are going to pick a 4.5 million striker, to definitely not pick Greenwood, and potentially not Lyle Taylor either, who is sitting around 13% at the time of recording. You're far better off going for a player like Cameron Archer or Luke Plange, who again, they probably won't get many minutes, but their ownership is low. Therefore, their price, if there is a change in the power curve, is far less likely to drop, and drop so dramatically and in such a quick time. And that's it, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed. And if you did learn something new, as I said at the start, if you could like the video, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the FPL uploads coming later this week. Finally, if you want to follow me on socials, my Twitter is @mturnbull78 if you want to follow the discussion there. And if you want to buy one of these lovely jumpers or shirts that I'm wearing, not these exact ones, but ones similar to it, then head over to my Depop. That's also @mturnbull78, and it will also be in the description down below. And I will see you very soon.